Welcome. I'm Emily Ponchel, the Public Programs Manager here at the Newberry. Thank you for joining us for this evening's wing lecture on the history of the book. And I must say that it is so wonderful to have all of you here in person. So great. The Newberry Library supports and inspires research, teaching, and learning in the humanities. Since our founding in 1887, the Newberry has remained dedicated to deepening our collective understanding of ourselves and the world around us. We connect researchers and visitors with our collection in the Newberry's reading rooms, exhibition galleries, program spaces, classrooms, and our online digital resources. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Jill Gage, custodian of the Newberry's John M. Wing Foundation on the History of Printing, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Jill?
Thank you. The first time that I heard Clairebourne talk about her work was at the Modern Language Association conference in Chicago in 2019. And I remember being incredibly excited about it and thinking, I am definitely inviting her to give the next wing lecture. And 3 years later, here we are. As I listened to that talk in 2019, I also thought about how much Bourne's work might appeal to people who make books, which is important to me because the Wing collection, upon its founding in 1919, was intended as a working library for printers and designers and type designers. And I've long wanted to bring bookmakers and book historians more into conversation with one another here at the library. So with that in mind, I commissioned the London book designer David Pearson to design a broadside. I call it a broadside, he calls it a poster. He wrote poster design by David Pearson on the thing, so I guess he wins. So I invited him to make a poster based on Claire's work. Claire sent David lots of photographs and notes, and he turned out something quite extraordinary. David's not here tonight, obviously, so I must extend a transatlantic thank you to him for taking on this project of the sort that he normally doesn't do with such good cheer and wit and brilliance. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Clairebourne is Assistant Professor of English and Director of Undergraduate Studies in English at Penn State University, where she specializes in Shakespeare, early modern drama, the history of the book, theater history, and textual editing. Her monograph, Typographies of Performance in Early Modern England, published by Oxford University Press in 2020, examines how texts written specifically for theatrical performance were transformed into reading texts by the early modern book trade. It has been called an authoritative intervention in bibliography and literary history, as well as a hymn to the craft of early modern printing. Bourne is also the editor of the Art in Shakespeare's Shakespeare/Text, Contemporary Readings in Textual Studies, Editing, and Performance, published in 2021, which sets new agendas for the study and use of the Shakespearean text. In 2018, Bourne published an essay in Early Modern English, Marginalia, published by Routledge, about a copy of the Shakespeare First Folio at the Free Library of Philadelphia that had been annotated by a then unidentified 17th century owner. Her essay inspired the discovery by Jason Scott Warren at Cambridge that the annotator was, in fact, John Milton. Dramatic pause. Her current project, tentatively called Accidental Shakespeare, looks at, quote, accidental features such as punctuation, spelling, and anything else affecting the formal presentation of the text in Shakespeare editions from the early modern period through the 20th century. Her talk tonight is part of this project. So without further ado, I turn things over to Clairebourne.
So I'm going to start with a quote. I'll read it, don't worry. The devastation of time, the imperfection of the machinery of reproduction, both mechanical and human, editorial impertinence, and our own ignorance or neglect of the methods and conventions of past ages combine to mutilate, obscure, and distort the picture which former writers have left of their world, their belief and hopes. The record is one not to be read easily, but with anxious care in the restoration of accidental injuries and the failures of transmission, and with understanding of past conditions. This excerpt from an unpublished preface to an unknown work is preserved as part of Osborne Manuscript 162 at Yale's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. It was handwritten by Walter Wilson Gregg, the figurehead of a highly influential school of textual scholarship, now known as the New Bibliography. In a nutshell, he and his colleagues spent the better part of the 20th century experimenting with methods for identifying the non-authorial features of printed books in order to isolate authorial ones. Here, Gregg worries about what happened to the beliefs and hopes, immaterial things, of former writers like Shakespeare, and the textual manifestations of their worlds, their words, their works, as they pass through human hands, networks, and machines. Gregg is not wrong to stress that the documentary record requires specialist reading practices, but the restoration he envisages as the outcome of this anxious care for a damaged textual corpus is one that strips the objects that comprise it of accidental injuries and failures of transmission, which is to say, if we're being honest, of their bookishness, of the human and machine labor that made them, and thus of the materiality that defines them. In short, Gregg and the editors who took up his methods were deeply concerned with the distorting effect of textual transmission on authorial intention. And this was not just an ambient disquiet about typos, but also a fear, as Jeffrey Maston has shown, over lowly print shop typesetters exerting their so-called personal predilections, especially for certain spellings, over the words of as great a writer as Shakespeare. I would add to this list of concerns a consternation that compositors' responsive solutions to the pressures of movable type printing could literally reshape a text in ways that affected and effected meaning. What I will suggest here tonight via a quartet of short vignettes that range from Shakespeare's moment through our very own is not just that the material features of the text are often intrinsic to what counts as and amounts to readers' experiences of the work in the first place. I also want to show how typography, by which I mean the whole art of printing and the inked and uninked manifestations of that series of acts on the page, has shaped our notion of the Shakespearean text, even as design work has been dismissed as incidental or overlooked completely in mainstream scholarship and editorial practice. Part 1, Dramatic Typography and the Incredible Vanishing Pilcrow. Sometime in the 1510s, John Rastall printed the first English playbook that we know of. Although dialogic texts had come off the presses of William Caxton, Wynkyn de Worde, and other English printers trained on the continent in the late 15th century, this two-part interlude, called Fulgens and Lucrece, was written for performance. Fulgens and Lucrece is a dramatic adaptation of a Latin treatise called On True Nobility, which was translated into French and eventually into English by John Tiptoft. Henry Medwall used Tiptoft's translation, which Caxton had published in 1481, as a source text for his dramatization of the story. From a typographic standpoint, Rastall's edition, on the left, looks very little like the English playbooks available for purchase in London bookstalls at the end of the 16th century, when Shakespeare was writing. Where Fulgens and Lucrece was printed in blackletter and laid out in 2 columns, speech tags on the left, dialogue in the middle, texts of plays like Titus Andronicus, the earliest known edition of a Shakespeare play, were set in a combination of Roman type for dialogue and italics for speech tags and stage directions, and laid out in a single column. The other conspicuous difference is, of course, the presence of pilcrows, that paragraph mark, or a version of it here in Rastall's playbook. But what constituted a paragraph or basic formal unit of dramatic material was an open question at the turn of the 16th century. But printers like Rastall ultimately isolated the speech, whether one line or many, as drama's equivalent of the paragraph, by placing pilcrows at the start of every new unit of dialogue. The pilcrows helped readers navigate what would otherwise have been a single undifferentiated column of text, given that speaker names were typically printed in the outer margin of every page. Printers and publishers solved the problem of making these texts legible as plays and got around having to include reading tutorials by appealing to readers' established proficiencies. They essentially repurposed pilcrows, also called capitula, which means heads in Latin, from the practice of scribal rubrication to articulate the dialogue form of vernacular interludes. So see this copy of Medwell's source text for Fulgens and Lucrece, where spaces have been left in the printed text for a scribe to supply pilcrows by hand and thus articulate a change of speaker within the prose. The appropriation of this textual arrangement for drama eased readers into a conceptual space between page and stage, between the material book and the idea of performance that play reading required. So in the middle of the 16th century, several related factors spurred changes in the way that pilcrows were deployed to structure the act of play reading. In some cases, printers did not have enough pilcrow type sorts in their inventory to implement a complete treatment of the play's dialogue. This is evident in the third edition of Like Will to Like, published in 1587, which you see here, where printer Edward Aldie used two different kinds of pilcrows, one with a single descender and one with two descenders, and set double daggers to stand in for pilcrows so that he could articulate the beginning of every new speech. Even though he significantly modified the mise-en-page of the previous edition, which you now see on the left, he must have considered the pilcrows important enough to the book's design protocols that he not only preserved them, but also improvised with the extra glyphs available to him when he realized that he would not have enough pilcrow sorts to complete the job. As Stanley Morrison once observed, type design, quote, moves at the pace of the most conservative reader. The same is true for typographic convention more generally. And early printers who experimented too much, too quickly, were often met with resistance from readers. In this way, printed pilcrows from the beginning were skeuomorphs, allowing printed plays to absorb features of the previous technology so the newer one felt more usable. Once readers understood how to read plays using the navigational signals that pilcrows provided, these glyphs were no longer necessary. As printing longer commercial theater plays put more of a strain on type supply than interludes like Fulgens and Lucrece had done, pilcrows did not so much disappear from the pages of printed plays as they were replaced by an even more powerful and flexible graphic mechanism, the blank space. The eventual privileging of indents over pilcrows had nothing to do with indents being easier to set than pilcrows. After all, the indent is not nothing. Setting a piece of type to produce a blank space required of the compositor as much labor as setting a glyph. The indent, though, would persist as a convention of articulating the dialogue in printed plays by Shakespeare and others for centuries to come. Part 2, casting off and the first Shakespearean scene divisions. The first scene divisions in a printed Shakespeare text resulted from a print shop accident. The printer Edward Aldie, whom we've already met, unwittingly began setting type for the last 6 sheets of the first edition of Romeo and Juliet, published in 1597, in smaller type than his partner John Danter was using for the first 4. So this is just a visualization of that. After casting off their manuscript copy text, a process that helped determine the number of sheets required to accommodate the amount of text assigned to each printer, Aldie and Danter started printing their allocations in their respective shots simultaneously. Here you see, on the left, Danter enlisted a 12-point English type. His smaller pica type had been recently confiscated, while Aldie's compositors reached for his typical 10-point pica Roman. While setting type for sheet F, Aldie seems to have realized he had a problem. He would not have enough lines of text to fill his 6-sheet quota. As a job printer, Aldie relied on filling the sheets for his payday, so we could say he had a financial incentive to compensate for his mistake. But it's also possible that by the time he realized his mistake, he couldn't compress the text enough to save a sheet, so he opted for expansion instead. Aldie and his compositors cushioned the remaining text with extra lines of white space, ample leading around centered stage directions to force new type lines, and by setting exit directions on separate lines. Most conspicuously, though, he set 2 lines of square type ornaments across the page in 11 places to divide the text into discrete units. Such ornaments had been variously configured and used in English printed books since the 1560s, and by the 1590s would have been legible to readers as meaningful features of the printed page. They helped, as Juliet Fleming has suggested, readers navigate the positioning of writing, quote, within the physical and cognitive spaces that comprise the interior architecture of the book. So Aldi himself used the very same or similar type ornaments in other books for decoration and generic cohesion, as in Samuel Daniel's Cleopatra here, and my favorite example, as bearing type, as in the trimming of Thomas Nash, which was actually printed the same year as Romeo and Juliet, and these are the same pieces of type. One modern editor of Romeo and Juliet has suggested that Aldi situated the bars of ornaments between the scenes, as if the scene were a stable and definable unit of dramatic form in 1597. I'm here to tell you it was not. Numbered scene divisions did not become a consistent feature of playbook page design until the 1630s, perhaps a symptom of the practical, sometimes incompatible ways that plays were divided to facilitate performance. So plays were carved into units of stage occupancy in theatrical documents called backstage plots, which recorded entrances, exits, and circulation of handheld props to give actors a sense of the play's general choreography. The horizontal lines here signal a clear stage, but the units of stage occupancy they created did not necessarily map onto fully realized units of dramatic action. So while modern editors have come to treat the cleared stage as the de facto end of one scene and the start of another, the textual divisions that Aldi created were not so formulaic, but his positioning of the ornaments was neither careless nor capricious. As John Jowett has suggested, Aldi must have stopped printing after sheet E to revise the initial calculations of how much copy should be printed on a given page. These recalculations accounted for where exactly to place the ornaments. Those placements had the effect of mediating the use of stage space and theater architecture to divide the action and performance for the audience. Furthermore, they read as visual correlatives for the obstacles of time, place, and circumstance that animate the play's tragic endgame. So let me explain what I mean. The first of the ornaments appear as a pair and together partition Capulet's negotiations with Paris about expediting his marriage to Juliet from Juliet's exchange with Romeo at the window after their wedding night. These ornaments divide Capulet's expression of what he desires for Juliet from Juliet's expression of what she desires for herself. The next bar of ornaments then separates the lovers' final exchange from Juliet's parents, specifically Lady Capulet's joyful news that Juliet's wedding to Paris is imminent. On the one side of the ornament, Romeo bids goodbye, the nurse warns Juliet her mother is coming, and Juliet goeth down from the window. On the other side, at the top of the facing page, is a description of Juliet entering with her mother and the nurse. So the exact staging logistics of this transition are not described, but that hardly matters for readers. The ornament creates a visual barrier between outside and inside, window and bedroom, night and day, and in terms of staging, above and below. And then it also realizes in typographic form Juliet's divided loyalties to husband and family. So the ornament refuses to act as writing at the same time as it fundamentally alters how the writing on the page can be read. So other divisions also break up the text in ways that evoke the significance of stage movement and typographically mediate misconnections and misunderstandings within the fiction of the play. For example, this ornament implies a cleared stage and a change of fictional location from the friar's cell back to the Capulet's house, but it also divides Juliet, now in league with the friar, from her father and mother, who believe that she's agreed to their plan. Another ornament then notes a shift to Juliet's room, where she is eventually left alone to take the friar's potion. She drinks it and, quote, falls upon her bed within the curtains. The ornament below this description on the right is the first to be situated where the stage does not clear, marking not only division between night and day, but also acting as a kind of proxy for those bed curtains separating Juliet's dead body, very much still a conspicuous presence on stage, from the household activity of preparing for her wedding. So Aldi did not have to place an ornament here. So you see what you just saw on the left here. As the mock-up on the right shows, he could have used other space-wasting techniques. So it's all the more notable that he placed a division here where the scene doesn't clear and speaks to his larger purpose in dividing the text. So the ornaments that follow separate the Capulet house in mourning from Romeo and Mantua learning of Juliet's death and procuring poison, from Friar Lawrence's realization that his plan has failed. The latter scene here reminds readers that Friar John, with his letters of great weight, and Romeo are definitely not in the same place. While these ornaments all articulate discontinuities in fictional time, place, and circumstance, the last two ornaments in the book divide the sequence of events that play out in the churchyards of the same place into three distinct units. Romeo's slaying of Paris and then his own suicide, the friar's appearance to check on Juliet, her suicide, and finally the convergence of the play's remaining characters on stage. Modern editors always consolidate these actions into a single scene, since the place doesn't change and the actor playing Juliet, although dead, is on stage throughout. However, in setting up two typographic barriers, one between Romeo and Juliet and one between the lovers and their parents, Aldi affects typographically the misconnections that spur the play's catastrophe. Unlike letters, numbers, and punctuation marks, these ornaments play no role in the construction of semantic meaning. They do, however, transform the final pages of the playtext into spaces where non-semantic meaning shapes our understanding of dramatic situation. The ornaments that resulted from a typesetting accident also came to articulate that the non-lexical business of performance intensified the effect of accidents within the fiction of the play, the estrangement of Juliet and Romeo from family, life-saving knowledge, and each other. Aldi showed that and how it might be possible to lay a scene in print. 3. Edward Cappell and the English Book of Shakespeare. My accounts of Shakespeare in type so far have focused on the role of contingency in the early modern print shop and printers' creative solutions to strains on type supply and miscommunication. Through such experimentation, typographic conventions for printed plays consolidated over the course of the 17th century, but remained responsive to shifts in theatrical practice and performance style. For example, dashes emerged out of Ben Jonson's early 17th century comical satires as typographic correlatives for bodily reactions to intemperance, smoking, burping, hiccuping, other physical monomanias, and proliferated in subsequent playbooks to instantiate an endless variety of unprintable nonverbal stage business. By the time Nicholas Rowe prepared the text of Shakespeare's plays for what is now considered the first edited edition of the works in 1709, dashes were substantive features of Shakespearean dramatic typography. Here in Antony's speech over Caesar's dead body, as here, where each dash invites the reader to imagine Antony pointing to one of Caesar's wounds, look, see, and mark. And as visual breaches in the text, they also evoke the breaches in the dead emperor's body. But I turn now to Edward Cappell's blank slate edition of Shakespeare in the mid-18th century. Cappell micromanaged the specifics of typeface, paper, and human labor to imbue the codex with Shakespearean authority, and against the backdrop of an increasingly global transmission of the Shakespearean text, to assert the playwright's Englishness. In 1758, a slim, neatly printed edition of Antony and Cleopatra came to press. Like most 18th century editions of Shakespeare to date, the publication of the standalone playbook was underwritten by the Tonson family publishing house. But in almost every other respect, it signaled a radical departure from editorial conventions associated with English drama and from book design protocols more generally. This small codex was Cappell's first attempt to manifest an editorial vision that linked, and these are his words, the clean and uncluttered page to what Brandy Adams has recently called a fair Shakespeare. That is a Shakespeare purged of the blemishes, and that is Cappell's word too, caused by careless printhouse personnel as well as past editors. Reading Shakespeare editions prepared in the early 18th century was, to Cappell, as frustrating as navigating a, quote, wilderness, a bibliospace in need of cultivation, of control, and of culture. He lamented the paginary intermixture of text and comment that cluttered the pages of other editions, such as Johnson was working on his edition at the same time. Cappell saw it as his duty to restore what he called, quote, and this is at the bottom here, that fair country, the poet's real habitation. And he would do it by using the early printed editions as the foundation for this venture. The fair country to which he refers is, of course, England, which he says must forever glory in Shakespeare's light. But for Cappell, the poet's real habitation was textual too. He had to design an edition worthy of Shakespeare's fair English identity. The first step was getting a handle on textual history. Between the late 1740s and 1779, Cappell bought or sought access to every edition of Shakespeare that he knew existed. It's a mind-boggling enterprise. And these are advertisements that he put out trying to find them. It was the first comprehensive attempt to collect early printed books by and related to Shakespeare. And the majority of the books gathered by these labors, which is in purple here, that's a list of all the editions that we now know existed. And that's what Cappell managed to get in purple. They survive in the collection of Shakespeareana that Cappell built, rebound catalogs, and ultimately bequeathed to the Wren Library at Trinity College, Cambridge. And this allowed him to do something that no editor of Shakespeare had done before, to collate, that is, meticulously compare the texts of all the early editions. Previous editors had paid lip service to collating by claiming to have consulted early editions on an ad hoc basis when faced with puzzling textual problems. But mostly they just used the most recent edition as a basis for their new ones. By contrast, Cappell's efforts to recover the earliest textual witnesses of Shakespeare's drama were completist in scope and ambition. His first attempt at representing this labor typographically was published in 1760, almost 10 years into his preparations for the Shakespeare edition. That year, Cappell edited a collection of anonymous early modern texts and published them in a small volume called Prelusions, which means experiment or rehearsal. He used these texts as prototypes for the techniques of textual presentation he had partially trialed in Antony and Cleopatra. The title page characterized these mini editions as, quote, specimens of the integrity that should be found in the editions of worthy authors. Among these specimens was Edward III, a play thought to be written by Shakespeare. So Cappell could experiment on a little-known play with ostensible links to Shakespeare without any direct threat to Shakespeare's reputation. Well before 1760, Cappell had acquired both early quarters of this play, and these are his copies. In a list, I know, he's so cute. Makes you kind of want to dance. Okay, in a list of the two editions printed on its own page at the end of his edition, he situated an asterisk next to the edition he had chosen as his base text. Under the heading Editions Consulted, he transcribed the text of the title page, noted the book's format, and recorded the last signature to note the length of the book. He also labeled the entries A and B in blackletter font. These labels were essential to the design of his collation notes, the first ever to appear in an edition of an early modern play, because they served as coordinates for the source of each textual variant, so readers could track his interventions in several ways. In a single line of footnotes underneath the playtext, he noted conjectural emendations in the playtext by offering the reading from the early text on which that conjecture was based. If the conjecture had no basis in an early edition, he made his own intervention even more conspicuous by printing it in blackletter. And in cases where he had chosen between two viable readings from different editions, he furnished the rejected reading in the list of various readings at the end and labeled all rejected readings with the letter corresponding to the edition from which it derives, so A or B. And so you can see here, of your army, and then the rejected reading is of our army. This typographical reference system manifested Cappell's efforts to get his text as close to the closest texts to Shakespeare as possible. Cappell's commitment to textual aesthetics, what he called the beauty of his page, was on a completely different scale than that of his predecessors. He sought to create textual arrangements that permitted access not only to a textual past, but also to a theatrical present via a novel system of punctuation that noted changes in tone and other nonverbal business. He had marks for irony, change in address, asides, a thing shown or pointed to, and a thing delivered. He first used these symbols without explanation, in a 1758 edition of Antony and Cleopatra, just wait, which was published as publicity for a David Garrick production of the play. It is not clear whether the marks captured the choreography of the Garrick production or whether Cappell even consulted Garrick about their presence or placement. Cappell's appointment to the position of Deputy Inspector of Plays earlier in his career meant that he would have had some sense of contemporary performance practices that almost certainly informed his deployment of these glyphs, but he's also drawing from implications in the text itself. So no matter how effectively Cappell thought his glyphs decluttered the page, the absence of instructions for how to read them was, to say the least, problematic. William Warburton complained The play is extremely prettily printed, and without a doubt the mysterious marks mean something. But I think it would be an impertinent curiosity in the public to ask what. Mid-18th century readers would have been conditioned to read some of the symbols in that schema, the cross and the double cross, or dagger and double dagger, as reference marks positioned in the text block to point out illuminating marginalia or footnotes. But the way Cappell used them was way too ingenious. Instead of referring to supplementary text somewhere else on the page or in the book, they referred to the conceptual interstitial space between book and theater, where the actions and interactions they evoked could be realized in readers' imaginations. Cappell responded to the confusion in Prolusions, where he implored readers to embrace this new dramatic typography as an improvement. It is hoped that when these new invented marks are a little considered, they will be found by the candid and discerning to be no improper substitutes to those marginal directions that have hitherto obtained, which are both a blemish to the page they stand in and inadequate to the end proposed. Simply put, adding marginal directions to clarify stage business stained the page. Cappell was so confident that readers could intuit how to interpret these symbols that he did not describe the function of each glyph anywhere in his Shakespeare edition. Instead, he provided a footnote in the introduction pointing readers back to Prolusions. If these new pointings, and also of certain marks that the reader will meet with in this edition, do not occur immediately to the reader, as we think they will, I love the parentheses there, he may find it explained to him at large in the preface to a little octavo volume entitled Prolusions. So go buy my other book so you know what you're looking at here. It's good marketing, maybe. This footnote reveals Cappell's gross miscalculation of how much typographic change readers were willing to tolerate all at once. Spoiler alert, not very much. This was one of the reasons why Cappell's edition of Shakespeare failed. Still, Cappell's Shakespeare edition represents the fullest expression of an editorial vision that he himself characterized as a mastered wilderness. Cappell distilled decades of his own book collecting and textual collation into what he called as small a compass as possible by constructing a brand new editorial infrastructure, and that's a term I borrow from Alan Gailey and Rebecca Niles. And he did so from the long familiar materials of movable type printing. This typographic scaffolding displayed for the first time the textual foundations on which an editor of Shakespeare had based his editorial decisions. And Cappell's acts of editorial decontamination were equally expressed in his choice of type and paper. Cappell was involved with book design at every level. His Antony and Cleopatra was one of the first books, possibly the second book ever, to be printed on wove paper, which was produced by a new technique of papermaking that eliminated the textured chain lines that characteristic of the laid paper on which Shakespeare's plays had hitherto been printed. Wove paper was produced on a mold where brass wires were tightly intertwined rather than crisscrossed in parallel lines and at right angles. So the result, which you see on the bottom here, was a paper with a smooth rather than a ribbed surface. It was also much brighter and uniformly whiter than laid paper, which retained an uneven beige color. Its whiteness must have been appealing to Cappell, as it literalized the fairness of the habitation he sought for Shakespeare's texts. It was the perfect substrate for this new editorial aesthetic that valued blank marginal space over the, quote, inches of commentary and editorial stage directions that had accreted on the pages of other Shakespeare editions. Notably, wove paper was developed by the English papermaker John Watman in collaboration with the English type designer and printer John Baskerville. Its even surface made it more suitable for Baskerville's finely cut typeface. And the effect, which was on display for the first time in Baskerville's edition of Virgil, printed just 1 year before Antony and Cleopatra, was crisp and restrained. Cappell's use of wove paper put Shakespeare on the same page as Virgil. But instead of using Baskerville's fonts, Cappell opted for type from the Caslon type foundry. It was a choice likely made in collaboration with Dryden Leach, the printer he hired to realize his vision. Leach was well known for his work on fine press books, and his portfolio would include a Caslon type specimens by the time he was hired to print Cappell's Shakespeare edition. The delicate serifs of Caslon's long primer number 1 made a fine impression on the smooth surface of the pristine English-made paper. I'm betting that the choice of Caslon was no accident either. Not only did William Caslon the Elder establish the first truly successful type foundry in England, but his types quickly gained a reputation for exceeding their continental counterparts. Caslon type was also intimately connected with the British state, as his foundry became the sole supplier of fonts to the king's printers. Before transitioning from gun engraving to letter cutting, Caslon had also held a contract from the Board of Ordnance for engraving the royal cipher. Daniel Updike issued this retrospective assessment of Caslon in the early 20th century. Caslon's types are thoroughly English. There are other letters more elegant, for the Caslon characters do not compare in that respect with the letters of Garamond or Grandjean. But in their defects and qualities, they are the result of a taste typically Anglo-Saxon and represent to us the flowering of a sturdy English tradition in typography. Printed on English-made wove paper in type designed by the first successful English type cutter, the volumes that make up Cappell's Shakespeare comprise a thoroughly English habitation. As Cappell wrote of Shakespeare's plays in his dedicatory epistle to the Duke of Grafton, the following great productions are talked of wherever the name Britain is talked of, that is, wherever there are men. But their value is not a little diminished by the numerous and gross blemishes, spots in the sun's body, which prevent his glory breaking forth. I could flatter myself justly that I had at last removed those blemishes and set this glorious poet in his due state of brightness. I kind of think Cappell was reading some Milton as he was writing. For Cappell, that state of brightness was as literal, the bright wove paper kissed with fine-cut Caslon type, as it was literary. Shakespeare was Britain, was the book. My final vignette. Enter the page as a lady, pandemic typography and feminist praxis. When Jill first invited me to give this talk, it was just a month before we all went into lockdown, I thought I might conclude by discussing one of the fine press revival editions of Shakespeare. Perhaps Charles Ricketts's commissioning of the Avon font for the Vale Press edition of Shakespeare's works, which also, by the way, used a, quote, lighter paper than the other books produced by the press. Or maybe Arthur Bullen's project of setting up a print shop 2 doors down from where Shakespeare's house once stood, with the express purpose of printing Shakespeare's plays in Shakespeare's hometown, with the same technology used to bring them to press in Shakespeare's day. Bullen said the idea came to him in a dream, insisted on using English-made paper watermarked with Shakespeare's coat of arms, hired from the Stratford labor pool, and yes, had a long back and forth with the Caslon foundry about getting the right combination of old-style fonts. There's also, of course, set designer Edward Gordon Craig's German and English editions of Hamlet for the German Kranach Press, the typography of which mediates between modernist performance and the page design of Incunabula, the first European books to come off the printing press. The edition reads as a, quote, reworking of the past, to borrow a phrase from Sarah Werner, not just because of its layout, but because Craig and his partner, Count Henry Kessler, commissioned a typeface from Edward Johnston, inspired by the 1457 Mainz Psalter. What's more, Johnston is most famous for designing the typeface that's used for all the London Underground signs. Again, an unmistakably British pedigree, even for a German book. In all 3 projects, as in Cappell's much earlier edition, typography was shorthand for authenticity. So in the time I have left, I want to turn from these earnest attempts to reinscribe Shakespeare at his point of origin, both geographic and temporal, to the use of typography as critique by women printers and bookmakers. In bookmaking on the distaff side, a limited edition compendium of textual materials written, designed, typeset, and printed by an association of female printers in 1937, Jane Grabhorn produced a parody prospectus for a new monumental edition of Shakespeare's works. The, quote, great project, she writes, quote, will not be printed in ink, which has the disadvantage of fading with the years, but in welded platinum with a vitality and an unparalleled magnificence. Grabhorn inverts and satirizes the homegrown aesthetic of previous fine press Shakespeare projects by describing this one as being produced from pilfering resources and labor from sites of colonial conquest, a binding made of antique rugs, a genuine solid ivory spine, and paper in GNU vellum, woven by Eskimos on their, quote, crude looms. The typeface used for the project will be handset. That's the name of the typeface. And was lifted bodily from an old Chinese monastery. And in a game of one-upsmanship re-authenticity, the prospectus notes with an exaggerated flourish that, quote, the Chinese, as everyone knows, were printing in handset type 6,000 years ago. Clairebourne ruthlessly mocks previous fine press editions for escalating the role of typography and the materials of bookmaking to enshrine Shakespeare in the trappings of Englishness. Which brings me finally to a book that was made in London by book artists Susan Johannecht and Catherine Meynell during the earlier days of the pandemic lockdown. Printed at the Geffen Press and Boundary Street Press as part of A.M. Bruno's One and Many Pages project, the bookmakers take a minimalist approach to typography and page design. Indeed, Johannecht and Meynell play with the concept of the page as both a substrate onto which text is printed and a character who pops up usually as a plot device in Shakespeare's plays. The book's status as a feminist critique begins with its title, Enter, open square bracket, the page as, close square bracket, a lady. This stage direction is lifted from The Taming of the Shrew, where the character of the page, disguised as a lady, is completely effaced from the text of the play as it is printed in the 1623 First Folio. The stage direction there is just Enter Lady. By using editorial brackets to reinsert the page back into the stage direction, Johannecht and Meynell draw attention to its past absence. The title functions as a microcosm for the book as a whole, in that Johannecht and Meynell print only paratexts that mention and dialogue that voices the character of the page. The effect is striking. The pages of the book are mostly blank. And then even where there is text to fill a significant part of the page, that text is characterized by another kind of blank, the etc., that assumes either enough readerly knowledge to fill in the blank or signifies off-script autonomy of the actor in performance. The grapheme &C for etc. is iterated again and again throughout the book as if to remind us not only of the unfillable gaps in the texts we define as Shakespearean, but also the erasure of certain identities from the play's fictional and theatrical worlds. After all, the reinsertion of the page into the stage direction chosen for the book's title reasserts the presence of an unnamed servant character at the same time as it erases the lady by showing her to be a fiction. The signifying presence of blank space across the pages of the book also testifies to the contingencies of making books during a global pandemic. As the colophon notes, Johannecht and Meynell used the variety of papers they had on hand to create the pages of the book, some of which are named only by where they are stored in the print shop. We might even go so far to say, and this might be a bridge too far, but humor me, that this textual performance of resourcefulness anticipated pandemic supply chain issues that came to impact the mainstream publishing industry in 2021. Paper, the page, is a condition of typography. Paper, the page, is a condition of typography, is the condition of Shakespeare as we know it. So the point of this book is not necessarily to put the fragments of text back into the context of plays from which they've been lifted. Instead, Johannecht and Meynell invite us to consider how these snatches of text resonate in the space of the page, within the book, and in relation to the conditions of the book's making. The character of the page says so little, and yet Shakespeare's plots often turn on such few words. But isolating key utterances and combining utterances from different plays generates new meaning. The book starts with the pages as a lady's lines from The Taming of the Shrew, ones that iterate deference, no matter whether the body we're imagining is male, female, or both. My lord, the page says. My lord, the page says. My lord and my husband and my lord, says the page. Then following pages and pages of page passages extracted from the text of Shakespeare's plays, Johannecht and Meynell reprint phrases from those extracts that in combination resonate with those of us, like the book's makers who have lived and are living through the pandemic. A 2-page spread, flourish on the verso, etc., on the facing recto, etc., again and again and again. Enter 2 pages, blank space, the present time, comma. A time marker that snaps us out of any fiction and into the now, with a comma signaling that the present time is not done. When birds do sing, page whistles and calls through the semi-translucent paper. Turn the delicate page, and the singing birds are in the past. Page whistles and calls. The page is telling us 'tis but begun. Looking back at mid-2020 from 2022, how true that was. How that life was but a flower, delicate, impermanent. Page with flowers and sweet water, from Romeo and Juliet, flowers and water for Juliet's grave, death, tragedy. And this is all I can say or know, the limits of our knowledge about what we are experiencing. This is the last page of the book. We lost not our time. These final words of the book, a reference to the making of the book itself, and a reflection on the possibility, and for some, the reality of loss. A page, do not forget the pages. Those who deliver your messages, who tell the time, who mourn the dead, who often labor in silence, who make art in times of crisis. Speaking of time, and speaking of crisis, I return to where I began, with W.W. Gregg's insistence on an anxious care in the restoration of accidental injuries and the failures of transmission, lest those injuries and failures, quote, distort the picture which former writers have left of their world. Gregg blames, among other things, quote, the imperfection of the machinery of reproduction, both mechanical and human, for this distortion. But I've been suggesting all along that what Gregg reads as accidental injuries and failures of transmission, type supply issues, casting off mistakes, too much typographic experimentation when readers weren't ready for it, and the actual breaking apart of the Shakespearean text to critique and remake it, are not injuries or failures at all. Instead, they expose the intentions and ideologies behind the objects that define what Shakespeare is or means in the first place. A writer of dialogue, a dramatist capable of a conceited, i.e. well-wrought tragedy, a symbol of Englishness and white supremacy, a corpus from which to make new art that critiques both past conditions and present realities. In this way, attending to Shakespeare in type is not about perfecting the text or celebrating the beauty of the page, but requires us to recognize the messiness and the difficulty of it all. Reading Shakespeare typographically means dwelling with the moments where typographic experimentation flirts with failure, because it helps us see how Shakespeare's text exists not in a critical vacuum, but in a very real and very flawed world. Thank you.
Claire, thank you so much for a beautiful lecture. And now it's time for our audience to ask some questions. And the first one that we have for you is general. How did you become interested in this topic?
That's a great question. So when I was in college, I worked in my college newspaper, and I got really interested in design and the way that page design helps readers navigate a document, how it draws attention to certain messages in that document. And I was also taking Shakespeare and early modern drama at the time. And it didn't occur to me that you could put those two things together until I was doing my master's and I took a bibliography course, and I kind of had an aha moment that, wow, if we, even in our modern editions, those editions are leveraging design protocols to help us navigate the text, or maybe even to frustrate, my students might say, to frustrate our navigation of the text. But then once I realized that I could go back and look at the early editions, I started to see connections everywhere. And I think I came to trust my own feeling about the difficulty of reading, rather than think that there was something wrong with me. And I think that this way of reading for difficulty and for typographic inconsistency is empowering, and that was my way in. right? Just because it's messy and difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention to it. In fact, we should pay attention to it because it is messy and difficult, not try to sweep it under the rug.
Well, we're very interested in the dirt in this room. So you mentioned the story of the confiscation of the 12-point font. The audience wants to know more about this story.
Yeah, so you're going to put me on the spot here, and I'm not going to have all the details, but Danter got into some trouble with the stationer's company, and when you get into trouble with the stationer's company, one thing that can happen is they take away your printing materials. So I think this is something that I've been thinking about just very recently about, like, well, why did this mistake happen? Because Danter, I need to go back and look at Danter's other printing from around this time to see when that 10-point typeface sort of faded away or phased out. But the type that he's using, that 12-point type, is really unusual for printed plays. It's 32 lines per page rather than 36 lines per page on average, and it's not very efficient. So yeah, he had it confiscated because he did something naughty, but I can't tell you what, so stay tuned.
All right, here's another one. It says, please tell us more about royal ciphers and the people that designed them.
Oh, wow. You guys are finding all the little pockets of this that I don't know a ton about. No, well, the royal cipher was the symbol of the monarch, and Caslon started. He got his start as a gun engraver, and he was in fact enlisted for type cutting because he was so dexterous in this art. And so one of the things he's doing is he's engraving the royal cipher on weapons that are used by the British Army at the time. So that emphasizes his connection to the state, just as his kind of monopoly on supplying type to the king's printers would do a little bit later in his career.
Here's a very good, and this is a question that I had too. So is there any evidence that these different editions affected the way that the plays were performed? Like, were there any did printer put in something and forever and past that point it was always that way, or?
Oh yeah, that's a really, really great question. So this is about performance after the early modern period.
It doesn't specify.
Okay, I'm going to take it to mean that. So something that a printer did, like what Aldi was doing in Q1 Romeo and Juliet, would that influence later performances of the play? Q1 Romeo and Juliet, the first edition, is a really great example because one of the space-wasting techniques, and this is John Jowett's argument, one of the space-wasting techniques is to beef up stage directions. So the stage directions in the second part of Romeo and Juliet, the first quarto, are unusually specific for an early modern play. Usually we get frustrated because stage directions are so reticent in early modern plays. And Jowett's argument is that Henry Chettle was brought in to write some stage directions to waste some space. And it's a really great example, like the Juliet falling into her bed behind the curtains, that's a first quarto only stage direction. Her coming down from the window, that's a Q1 only stage direction. So we base a lot of what we think about what happened in the early modern productions of Romeo and Juliet on that data, even if it's readerly data, which Jowett argues, but it also gives a lot more texture for future performers of the play to use. So indeed, Q1 is hardly ever used it's never used as the copy text for the editions of Romeo and Juliet that you've encountered. The 1599 second quarto or the 1623 folio, usually the second quarto of 1599 is used as the base text. But a lot of those stage directions from the first edition are imported into that edition. So what you ultimately have when you read editions of Romeo and Juliet is what we might call most Shakespeare editions are like this, but a kind of Frankentext where you have, the actual text from Q2 mainly, but then you have these stage directions imported and kind of sutured in. So yeah, I would say absolutely that I think that what printers are doing is influencing the way the plays are performed later on, because that's the data we have about the plays, right, is the text.
All right, we have lots of questions coming in, but we have time for just one more.
Okay.
And I think this is a good one for us to end on. It says, can you speak to trends you see in historical revisions of texts around raced, sexual, gendered readings of plays? And what methodological approaches may be useful in recuperating those potentialities for the contemporary stage?
Can you just repeat the first part of the question?
I can.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a big question.
No, it's a very good question.
Sure. It says,
Just wanna
can
make
you
sure.
speak to trends you see in historical revisions of texts around raced, sexual, gendered readings of plays? That's the first part of the question.
Okay. In terms of historical revisions, I'm going to talk about editing here. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways I would approach that question is to point back to W.W. Gregg and just point out how influential his school of textual scholarship has been. And that school of textual scholarship uses a lot of language. I point you to Brandy Adams' recent chapter. It's in the book that I edited. I'm not recommending it because I edited the book. I'm recommending it because it's a fascinating intervention in the field, but to show how the language that these scholars use to describe, much like what Cappell is doing, that the language that they use to describe their enterprise is founded on discourses of white supremacy, of misogyny, of homophobia. Jeff Maston has written really compellingly about this in Queer Philologies. I would go take a look at that as well. So I think before we can do the work in editing, we have to understand how the foundations of the editorial practices that we inherit are inherently racist, misogynist, homophobic, and biased. There's a lot of good work in disability studies around this as well. The language that we use to describe the text is privileges ability. I would encourage you to look at Brandy Adams' work and Jeff Maston's work in particular on these questions. But I think we need to address those foundational studies and the way they do their work, not just the methods that they're developing, but the way they present their methods to produce editions that speak to everybody and that are non-exclusionary. Right, and that are inclusive. And I hope that some of the work that I'm doing on Cappell kind of shows how that language can become insinuated in the way we talk about Shakespeare, or the way Shakespeare has been talked about.
Well, that's all the time we have this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you all so much.
And a thank you to Claire.